room I go into, this is fun. I'm Andrew Yang. I'm running for president as a Democrat in 2020. I'm not a career politician. I'm an entrepreneur and problem solver, and I never intended to run for president, to be very honest. I have various ways to prove that. So how did I come to be here with you all? Oh, one thing I want to say, we just got the news last week. I am the 9th candidate to qualify for the fall debate. And if you've been paying attention to this race, you know that puts me ahead of a half a dozen or so sitting senators and governors and people who've been in politics a long time. So I want you all to answer this question or wonder with me. It's like, how the heck did that happen? How did Andrew Yang come out of nowhere and leapfrog people who've been preparing to run for president for years and years? So my path started, I grew up the son of immigrants. They told me, just do well in school. So I tried to do that. I went to law school. Anyone here do that? Two people, always a few. Nice. Was an unhappy lawyer for 5 months. It was not the job for me. And so I left to start a business. How many of you have started a business or organization? So if you started a business or organization, you know, one, that's incredibly hard. And two, when someone asks you how it's going, what do you say? Great! Great! The best! Two, you know you always have to tell everyone how great it's going, because no one wants to support a person who's like, oh, it's going terribly. So I started a business and it was too much for me. My business did not work out. It had its mini rise and maximum fall. My parents were still telling people I was a lawyer. But I've been bitten by the bug. I worked at another company in technology, and then I became the head of an education company that grew to become #1 in the United States and was acquired by a big public company in 2009. So if you all remember 2009, 10 years ago, it was a really tough time in the country, the aftermath of the financial crisis, and I thought I knew why the crisis had happened. That we had so many whiz kids heading to Wall Street who would come up with these financial instruments that had crashed the economy. I thought that was the problem. And it reminded me of myself a little bit when I was coming out of law school at the law firm, where we had all these smart kids doing the same sorts of work. And so I had the question, if I don't think that going to Wall Street and becoming financial whiz kids is the answer, what would a better answer be? So the answer I came up with was I wanted them to become entrepreneurs and start businesses in places like Birmingham, New Orleans, Detroit, Cleveland, Baltimore, St. Louis, Cincinnati, and other cities around the country. I thought we had this brain drain where so much talent was getting sucked up to Wall Street and now Silicon Valley and various consulting firms, and not enough entrepreneurs were moving to other parts of the country. So I donated some of my money. I started calling rich friends asking this question, do you love America? The smarter among them said, what does it mean if I say yes to this, Andrew? And I said, at least $10,000. Then 12 of them said, I love America for $10,000. It's like, I thought you did. How many of you get these phone calls? Anyway. So I raised some money and then spent 7 years helping create several thousand jobs in 15 cities around the country. I was awarded an Ambassador of Entrepreneurship by the Obama administration. And I worked with hundreds of entrepreneurs around the country helping create these jobs. This to me was like the highest form of service that I could come up with to try and reverse what I thought had led to the financial crisis. Now, how many of you, I get the sense many of you have come to South Carolina but didn't necessarily grow up here. So how many of you are from the Northeast? Wow. Look around that. How about Midwest? The South? South. West Coast? I had never seen Birmingham or New Orleans or St. Louis before starting Measure for America. And I was blown away by the gulf between St. Louis and San Francisco, or Michigan and Manhattan, where taking that 3-hour flight felt like I was traversing dimensions or decades and not just a few time zones. People were clapping me on the back saying, great work, Andrew, how did you create several thousand jobs? I said, no, you don't get it. I feel like I'm pouring water into a bathtub, and the bathtub has a giant hole in the bottom. And then I'm like putting water in, and then water's just rushing out the bottom. That's one example. Detroit, Michigan, had a peak population of 1.7 million people. Now its population is 680,000. So imagine a city that's 2/3 empty. And then if I helped create, let's call it 300 jobs in Detroit, like what does that mean in the context of losing 1 million people? So these were the things that I was grappling with in 2016, and then Donald Trump became our president. And if you're in this room, you probably weren't excited about that outcome. Though I'm sure, are people here in the room who voted for him.
Hesitate.
Yeah. Yeah. At least one, I know. There are others too. Yeah, in the back too. Thank you. Yang Gang has lots of people who voted for Donald Trump, which is great. That's how we win. So, if you were to turn on cable news, how would you think that Donald Trump won? Like, why do you think he's our president today?
Electoral college.
Electoral college.
Lack of voters.
The people are tired of career politicians.
He had a TV show. Right.
So these are the reasons I think you're right. Other things that come up on cable news: Russia, racism, Facebook, FBI, Hillary Clinton. So these are the ingredients as to why Donald Trump won. But I'm a numbers guy, and I looked at the numbers, and the numbers tell a different story. The numbers say the reason why Donald Trump's our president today is that we automated away 4 million manufacturing jobs in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Iowa, all the swing states he needed to win and did win. And if you don't believe that, there's actually data sets. There are data sets that show there's a direct correlation up between the adoption of industrial robots in a voting district and the movement to Trump in that district. It's one of the strongest correlations you can find. It's a straight line up. We're in the third inning of the greatest economic transformation in the history of our country, what experts are calling the fourth industrial revolution. What are the 5 most common jobs in the United States? Retail. Truck driver. Food service and food preparation, aka burger flipper. There are other types of food preparation, food service. But yeah, food prep. Healthcare as an industry would be there, but it's not really a job category.
Fulfillment center?
Clerical work, including call centers, and then manufacturing. What percentage? So I'm going to go through that list again. Retail, truck driving and transportation, food service, clerical and call centers, and manufacturing. What percentage of American jobs are in one of those 5 categories? It's about half. About half of American jobs. And if you look at each of them in turn, you see that they're shrinking fast. How many of you have noticed stores closing around where you live? Why are 30% of America's stores closing? Amazon, that's right. Amazon is sucking up $20 billion in business every single year. How much did Amazon pay in taxes last year? Zero. They're closing 30% of America's stores and malls, and the American public seeing zero in return. The most common job in America is working as a retail cashier. The average cashier is a 39-year-old woman making between $9 and $10 an hour. So if her mall or store closes, what is her next move going to be? I know when you call a big corporation and you get the software, what do? You say human, 000 as fast as possible, right?
Yeah.
You try and get rid of the software and find a human. I do the same thing. It's terrible. In 2 or 3 years, the software is going to sound like this. Hey, Andrew, how's it going? What can I do for you? It's going to be efficient, quick, delightful. You might not even know it's software. What's that going to mean for the 2.5 million Americans who work in call centers right now who make $14 an hour? If software, and you don't need genuine artificial intelligence to do that call center job. You just need a very, very sophisticated decision tree, and then software that can figure out what you're saying. They can even detect changes in your tone of voice. They can start figuring out if you're getting irritated. So this is 2 to 3 years away. Driving a truck is the most common job in 29 states in this country, including South Carolina. There are 3.5 million truckers. And my friends in Silicon Valley are working on cars and trucks that can drive themselves. Now, why do they want to build self-driving cars and trucks so badly? For the money. $168 billion a year in cost savings if they can automate truck drivers. That's an unfathomable amount of money. That's the kind of amount of money that makes everything possible. So I talked to my friends in Silicon Valley, and I asked them, how are we doing on self-driving trucks? They tell me they're 98% of the way there. Now, the last 2% is very stubborn, because you can't have trucks smashing into things at a 2% rate.
Thank you.
So very, very few trucks. And the self-driving trucks are really bad with something called snow. Because they need to be able to see the markings on the road, and if they can't see the markings on the road, they get confused. So here's how you're going to try and get over the last 2%. You all remember the first time you saw quality video on your cell phone? You all remember that? You remember that feeling? You were like, wow, we can do that now? So that's 3G, and we've had 4G. We're now looking at rolling out 5G. And one of the things that 5G is going to make possible is how they're going to get the last 2% of truck driving. So the plan is to equip the trucks with teleoperating software, where if the truck is in bad weather and doesn't know what to do, it will then beep at a warehouse in Nevada, and there will be a teleoperator in Nevada who will then beam into the truck and drive it like a video game, because the truck will have cameras on the front so that the driver who beams in can just like see it as if they're driving. And then when the computer says, okay, I've got it again, then they'll beam back out. What do you think the ratio will be between these teleoperators and the 3.5 million Americans who drive a truck for a living right now?
1%.
Maybe 2%? 3%? What's that going to mean for the 3.5 million truckers in the U.S. or the 7 million Americans who work at truck stops, motels, diners, and retail establishments that rely upon the truckers getting out and having a meal? Right now, if you're a truck driver, you have to stop driving at the 14-hour mark. Your truck will actually start seizing up and beeping at you. If you're doing more than 14 hours, you have to get out, take a nap, get a meal. The robot truck never needs to stop. So this is the near future. It may sound like science fiction, but it's here. This is the fourth industrial revolution. When's the last time you heard a politician say the words fourth industrial revolution? This is the first time. And I'm barely a politician. So this is what led me to come to you all to run for president. Actually, I didn't go to come to you first. The first thing I did is I went to Washington, D.C. I had the facts, the figures, the math, the PowerPoint, and I said, what are we going to do about the fact that we're in the midst of this transformation and the American people are scapegoating immigrants who have very little to do with the set of issues? We have to wake people up and start trying to solve these problems. What do you think the folks in Washington, D.C. said to me when I presented them with the question, what are we going to do?
Can't talk about it.
It's not on our polling, is what he said. Now, so the first response I got was, we cannot talk about that. One person said the American people will not understand it. The second big response I got was, we should study that further. And the third one, probably the most popular, was, we must educate and retrain all Americans for the jobs of the future. And that sounds very responsible. If you could be against that. So then I said, look, I looked at the effectiveness rates for government-funded retraining of manufacturing workers. Y'all want to guess how effective those programs were? 0 to 15%. That's right. Half of the manufacturing workers that lost their jobs left the workforce and never worked again. And of that group, half filed for disability. And then we saw surges in drug overdoses and suicides in those populations to the point where America's life expectancy has declined for the last 3 years in a row. You want to know the last time America's life expectancy has declined 3 years in a row? Oh, you were, yes. That makes you vote of the day now, yes. The Spanish flu of 1918, global pandemic. That's the last time America's life expectancy declined for 3 years in a row. We're back in Spanish flu territory because of drug overdoses and suicides overtaking vehicle deaths as leading cause of death in this country. In large part because we automated away 4 million manufacturing jobs. There was no retraining, really. They went home, started to drink themselves to death, and here we are. So what happened to the manufacturing workers? I studied economics and economic theory. None of this was in my textbook. What did the textbooks say would happen? Retrain, reskill, move for new jobs, higher productivity, invisible hand, all would be well. It's not what actually happened. What happened to the manufacturing workers will happen to the truck drivers. And this population will not take it well. Manufacturing workers, 70% male, 30% female. Truck drivers, 94% male. Average age 49. Average education high school or 1 year of college. Tens of thousands are ex-military. A dozen truckers just protested in the Midwest. They did something called a slow roll, where they started driving their trucks at 40 miles an hour on the highway, which obviously seized up traffic behind them. Hundreds of people were like, why are we all going so slow? Why did they do the slow roll? They were protesting the digital monitoring of their driving time. They did not like the fact that there was a device that was telling them when they had to stop driving. How do you think they'll take it when it's a robot truck that threatens their livelihood?
A lot of slashed tires.
A lot of slashed tires, what he said. Only 13% of truckers are unionized, so if you're hoping there's going to be some grand collective bargaining, there will not be. The vast majority of truckers are individual mom and pop business owners and truck owners. Imagine being a truck owner who mortgaged essentially your life savings Because these trucks are very expensive, like 6 figures. Imagine putting your life savings into a fleet of 5 trucks, having 10 drivers, driving them, and then all of a sudden they're robot trucks you can't compete with hitting the road. Do you think you might do something dramatic? Yeah. So this is what is coming down the pike. And when I went to Washington, D.C., they have no answers. They have no appetite. They don't want to touch this. If you were to be generous, you could say they don't understand it or don't think the American people are ready. If you were to be ungenerous, you would say they do not care. Because their job security does not depend upon them solving this problem. They actually think if they bring this problem up, it's going to be bad for their job security. So they do not care. And one person in Washington, D.C. said something that did lead me to you all. He said, Andrew, you're in the wrong town. No one here is going to do anything about this problem because this is not a town of leaders, this is a town of followers. And the only way we're going to do anything about it is if you create a wave in the rest of the country and bring it crashing down on our heads. I thank God I had someone with me that day, because you would think I was making that up, right? No, I had someone with me who was like, oh yeah, he said it. I'm here with you to create that wave. I said to that person, challenge accepted. I can do that. I can create a wave in the rest of the country. That's how I wound up on this debate stage in the fall. Is because I'm going around the American people saying, look, this is the biggest challenge that's driving so many of the other problems we have in our society. It got us Donald Trump. And this is what we must respond to. So how do we respond? If you've heard anything about me, you've heard there's an Asian man running for president who wants to give everyone $1,000 a month. You remember hearing that at some point?
Yeah.
And the first time you heard that, you were like, ha ha, that's a gimmick. Like, this cannot be serious. But this is a deeply American idea. It's been with us since our founding. Thomas Paine championed it. He called it the citizen's dividend. Martin Luther King was fighting for it in the 60s. He called it the guaranteed minimum income. And it is what he was fighting for the day he was assassinated in 1968. 1,000 economists, including Milton Friedman, endorsed this in the 60s and 70s. It was so mainstream it passed the U.S. House of Representatives twice, in 1971 under Richard Nixon. It came this close to being law. And then 11 years later, one state passed the dividend where now everyone in that state gets between $1,000 and $2,000 a year, no questions asked. And what state is that? Alaska. And how does Alaska pay for it?
Oil.
And what is the oil of the 21st century?
Technology.
Data. Data, technology, software, AI. A study just came out the other day that said data is now more valuable than oil. What they're doing for the people of Alaska with oil money, we can do for everyone in South Carolina and everyone in the country with technology money. Again, Amazon, $1 trillion tech company, paying zero in taxes. And we're all looking around being like, what the heck is going on? Like, where's the money going? The money's just getting spirited out of your community, that's for sure. And it's not just Amazon. Imagine the American people getting a tiny, tiny slice of every Amazon sale, every Google search, every Facebook ad, every robot truck mile. We can generate hundreds of billions in revenue very, very quickly. Especially because where will the money go when it comes to your hands? What would you actually spend it on in real life? He said a little bit goes back to Amazon, which I agree with. Yeah. But how much of the money would stay where you live? Most of it. Not all of it, but most of it. It would go to car repairs you've been putting off, or daycare, or visiting relatives, or the occasional night out. A lot of it would circulate right here in the community. It would grow the consumer economy in South Carolina by about 15%. It would create tens of thousands of jobs because every garage has to hire a new mechanic, every bar has to hire another server. Like, the jobs would actually be local and accessible. This is what I call the trickle-up economy. From our people, our families, communities up. And unlike the trickle-down nonsense that never worked, this would actually work. The money would circulate over and over again. It would make us stronger, healthier, mentally healthier, more productive, and it would value the kind of work that my wife does. My wife's at home with our 2 young boys, one of whom is autistic. What is the market value of her work at right now? Zero. And we know that's nonsense. We know that the work she's doing. I was off the trail taking care of our kids for a day or two, and you know what I said at the end of that period? Get me back on the presidential. Because if you're a parent, you know how hard that work is. Hardest work of all, most important work, and we value that zero. So, the freedom dividend, this trickle-up economy, it goes from being radical and far out and futuristic to being something we have to do as soon as we start really digging into the trends. Right now, as we're together, the labor force participation rate in the United States is 63%, which is the same levels as El Salvador and Costa Rica. And a lot of that is the lowest level in decades. And a lot of that is the exit from the workforce of unskilled men in particular. High school educated men have been leaving the workforce in droves. We're going to create new jobs in this economy, but it's going to be for different people with different skills in different places than the jobs we're getting rid of. And unfortunately, the number of jobs is going to be lower. This is just what the math says. So, big move number one, lay a foundation for people and start sharing in the bounty of the 21st century economy with the freedom dividend. We can completely afford it. An economy of 20 trillion plus, given the money would circulate back in over and over again in our communities, we can completely afford it. The second big move we have to make, how many of you got excited about GDP when you woke up this morning? Where you were like, oh, I hope GDP's up today, or like, oh, I think I can make a big contribution today. And I talked about my wife. What is her work figured out in GDP? Also zero. The inventor of GDP said that when the time he invented it 100 years ago, he said this is a terrible measurement for national well-being and we should never use it as that. Self-driving trucks will be tremendous for GDP, but they're going to be very, very bad for many, many Americans. So how would we measure our progress in a way that would actually correspond to how we are doing? That would actually get you excited if I were to come to you and say, hey, this got better.
Water. Clean water.
Clean air and water, that would get you excited if I said, hey, your air and water got cleaner.
Yeah. Less plastic.
Quality of life.
Affordable college.
Yeah, health and wellness, life expectancy. If I say your life expectancy is getting shorter, then it's kind of hard to feel too good about what's going on in the economy. But if you say that it's getting longer, then that's great. You're getting healthier. How about mental health and freedom from substance abuse? Affordability, childhood success rates. We have numbers for all these things. We can start measuring our economy in ways that would actually matter to us. Raise your hand again if you run a business. Imagine if you had the wrong measurements. Like, how's that business going to do? It's going to do terribly. And right now, we have the wrong measurements for our economic progress. We have GDP, which is just gross production. And as machines do more and more work, it's going to look really good for GDP and look worse and worse for us. Number two is stock market prices. And many of you, I'm sure, are investors. But you may also know that the bottom 80% of Americans own only 8% of stock market wealth, and the bottom 50% essentially own zero. So stock market prices correspond essentially to how the top 20% of Americans are doing. And then the third one's the headline unemployment rate, which doesn't include all the people dropping out of the workforce. It also doesn't include the fact that 40% of college graduates, recent college graduates, are underemployed. It doesn't include people doing 2 or 3 jobs. It doesn't include the fact that 94% of new jobs in the U.S. are temporary contractor jobs that don't have benefits. None of that gets figured into the headline unemployment rate. So imagine if you're a business and you have the wrong measurements. That's essentially where we are right now as a society. We're being told things are great, but we know in our hearts that things are not great. And if you remember candidate Donald Trump in 2015, what did he say about the economic numbers? Fake news. It's not real. Like, 95 million Americans out of the workforce. Now that he's president, you don't hear any of that. All of a sudden, it's like, oh, like the economic stats are great. Look at my GDP growth. He was right the first time. The numbers actually don't make that much sense relative to our well-being. So one of my most joyous duties as your president will be to update GDP for the 21st century. And I don't need Congress to do it. All I have to do is go down the street to the Bureau of Economic Analysis and say, hey, GDP, 100 years old, really out of date, kind of useless. How about we update it with the American scorecard that includes our health and affordability and mental health and environmental quality, and then we can report how we're doing on those measurements every year at the State of the Union. And then we have a real sense of how we're making progress or we're falling behind, and then we can invest resources in a way that would actually make us happier, healthier, and stronger over time. So those are a couple of the big moves that I want to make as your president. And the reason why we're doing so well is that I'm homing in on the real problems that got Donald Trump elected in the first place. I'm one of only 2 candidates that 10% or more of Donald Trump voters say that they will vote for, which means that after I'm the Democratic nominee, I will win cleanly. You know who the other candidate is? Bernie. Me and Bernie are the only 2 Democratic candidates that more than 10% of Trump voters say, I will vote for that person. That's one reason I'm doing so well. That if you remember in 2015 and 2016, here was the narrative. Donald Trump said things are going wrong, we're going to make America great again. What did Hillary say to that?
America's already great.
America's already great. And that was not what a lot of Americans wanted to hear. What I'm saying is, look, there are real problems in our country, but Donald Trump's solutions were backwards. What were his solutions? Build a wall, turn the clock back, bring the old jobs back. We have to do the opposite of all that. We have to accelerate our society forward as fast as possible. We have to evolve in how we think about work and value, and I am the ideal candidate for that because the opposite of Donald Trump is an Asian man who likes math. Math now is an acronym. What does math stand for?
Make America think harder.
Make America think harder. We have to start actually homing in on the real problems and get distracted by the tweet of the day, or frankly, the talking heads on cable news. You know, like, a lot of what's happening doesn't fit into the 30 or 60 second soundbite. I've now done dozens of cable news appearances, and man, is it hard to get a lot of information through in that format. It's really, it's not great for us. So this is why I'm doing so well, is that I can identify the real problems that are plaguing the American people and advance real solutions to solve them. That's why I'm not a politician too, is that like I frankly, my wife laughs about the fact that I'm running for president because she's like you make the worst politician on so many levels. And number one, she said, the number one reason you're being a terrible politician is that you tell the truth. Like even when it's like not convenient. And my team laughs at me because anytime they try and like have me go through a talking point, like they can tell if I'm struggling with it because it's like, oh, you must not like this because just like I'm a terrible poker player. Let's put it that way. The whole game plan is to tell the American people the truth and give us enough credit that we actually recognize the truth and we see it, and we have the wherewithal to solve our own problems. Right now, we just despair that we can't actually solve our own problems anymore. We think that our government's out to lunch, which it is, hopelessly bought and sold, which it is. Our votes don't matter, and that's the beauty of being here in South Carolina, is that here, you have the power to change the future of the country just by voting. It's one of only 3 or 4 places in the country that's true. I did the math. Do you know how many Californians each of you is worth? 500. So there are about 100 people in this room. What is that? 50,000 Californians, something like that? It's like a football stadium of Californians in this restaurant here today. Like, that's the math. That's the power. That's why I'm not the first or the last presidential candidate you'll probably see. What number candidate am I right now, actually? 8? Someone just yelled out 8, yeah. No, you said 1. Thank you, sir. That's good. I'm the first candidate to get him out. That makes me very happy. So the reason why we're all here is because this is one of the only places in the country that democracy actually functions. That you can take a message to the rest of the country like that. Very, very powerfully. The rest of the country is going to be looking around trying to figure out who's going to be the nominee, who's going to be the president. It's Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and then you. And the field's still going to be very, very fluid by the time it gets to you. So you're going to help determine the direction for the rest of the country, and we need to take this message out as fast as possible. Because you imagine another 4 years of this, the stores closing, the AI getting smarter, the trucks starting to hit the highways. We have to start moving the pendulum the other way as fast as possible. It's not left, it's not right, it is forward. And that's where we're going to move the country in 2020. So thank you. Let's take advantage of our intimacy. Yes, yes.
How will you handle Donald Trump on the debate stage?
Yes.
Oh, thank you, brother. So people have said that they're super excited to have me debate Donald Trump because where he's all bluster, he's fire, I'm ice. Like I'm very hard to offend, very cool and logical. And the problem Democrats have gotten into a little bit is that he comes up and he's like, hey, I'm a jerk, I'm a bully. And then the Democrats are like, don't do that. Or something along those lines. Or like, that's not, you know, like that's divisive. That's and then between those two messages, unfortunately, he comes across as like a little more authentic or authoritative or something along those lines. In my case, like, I would just diminish him by dismissing his arguments and making him seem like the buffoon and joke that he is. I'm a real entrepreneur, and most entrepreneurs regard Donald Trump as a marketing fraud and a charlatan. And so the American people will be able to tell very quickly the difference between a huckster and a genuine problem solver.
Don't you have some experience debating?
I was also on the U.S. national team for debating. Went to the World Championships in '92 in Aylesbury, England. So I'm, I suppose, a national champion debater. There is that. But you know, for whatever reason, I don't think people take that credential that seriously. But it is true. Yes, sir.
Who would be your VP pick?
So my rule on the VP has to be, number one, someone I genuinely would love to work with, and number two, someone I would love to see as our next president. And I haven't spent enough time with some of the other candidates to be able to say authoritatively who I would choose, but I will say that I have a strong preference for choosing a woman. Because I think that organizations and companies and societies work better when men and women work together. The truth is that if you get a bunch of men alone for a while, we kind of become idiots over time. My preference would be to have a female VP. Yes, miss.
What are you going to do about all the money in Washington, all the PACs and the lobbyists and all that? We've got to get that out of the federal government. They're controlling that right now.
Now, the best way is to actually wash the money out. So what do I mean by that? So you have these ultra-rich corporations and lobbyists that have held our government captive over the last number of years. And this is again where the democracy of, like the voters of South Carolina, can really make a difference. So my plan is to issue 100 democracy dollars that every citizen can only give to political candidates or campaigns, and that's use it or lose it. Now hear me out. Right now, I've been running for president for a little while, and thanks to the Yang Gang, I have not had to hustle for corporate money. We've raised $3 million in the last 6 weeks, in average increments of only $24. So my fans are even cheaper than Bernie's. You didn't know it was possible, but yeah, it's possible. Cheaper than Bernie's. Yang Gang. Gang, gang. So if you give $25, you're an above average member of the gang. All right. So I understand the hustle that politicians have to go through. So here's the deal. If you're a politician, you have the voters, then you have the money. And unfortunately, they come from two different places. And over time, you start listening to the money more because it's easier to measure. It helps you get reelected more directly, and so you start gravitating towards the money. So the plan is then to put the money into people's hands and make it so that if I get 10,000 South Carolina voters behind me, that's $1 million. And then when the lobbyists come and say, hey, I've got a check for $80,000 for you, you'd be like, I don't care about your $80,000, I'm getting $1 million from the people. Because right now, we know that corporate money will just kind of creep its way back in. Even if you were to overturn Citizens United, they had lobbyists before that, they'll have lobbyists after that. That's their game. They have billions and billions of dollars at stake. So the best plan is to wash the money out. And if you have these democracy dollars in the hands of the American people, then the legislators' incentives would turn back to the voters. If I get enough voters to give me their $100, then I don't need the lobbyist money. That's the best way to get the money out of Washington, is trying to wash it out. Yes, miss.
What kind of jobs are you going to train these people to do in the future?
We need to invest massive levels of resources in vocational apprenticeship and technical ed in this country. Right now, only 6% of American high school students are in technical or vocational tracks. In Germany, it's 59%. So think about that difference. We should clearly be higher than where we are. And if you talk to employers, we have millions of unfilled jobs in the technical and vocational areas. Those jobs are also much, much harder to automate away. Can you imagine what it would take to make a robot plumber? Think about that. It's going to be a human plumber for a long time, and they're still going to gouge us. Because who the heck knows what they did under there? And then they come up and be like, I had to do this. You're like, yeah, whatever. Sure, here you go. Anyway, sorry, I shared some experience I had. So we need to invest money in technical vocational ed at a very high level. We're overprescribing college to our young people, and there are many people going to college who probably should not have gone to college. We've also made college 2.5 times more expensive, and then loaded people up with life-changing debt. So there are massive imbalances. One way to try and train people for jobs is just by making technical and vocational education more common. We do need to invest in retraining programs with the acceptance that most of these retraining programs will not be effective at scale. And one joke I tell, but it's true, if you go to a truck stop and you say to them, hey, how would you like to be retrained as like a logistics specialist, they'd be more likely to punch you in the face than sign out your clipboard. You know what I mean? You've been to a truck stop? You know what I'm talking about? So we have to be real. And the most effective retraining programs are based around existing jobs. If you have an existing employer who says, hey, I need 100 people with these, then you can go out and try and train those people. That actually has a higher effectiveness rate. If you're a school saying, I'm going to train people for what I think employers need, that has a very low effectiveness rate. So we have to find the employers and essentially try and scale up hiring solutions for them so that we can connect people to the opportunities. The freedom dividend would be immensely helpful because if you have $1,000 a month, right now, one of the statistics that makes me saddest is that rates of interstate migration in the United States are at multi-decade lows. That is, people are just not moving. People aren't moving across state lines anymore. There are a multitude of reasons for this, but one is that people find moving very unaffordable and difficult. So we have to try and make it easier for people to move to where there might be a job waiting for them, and then actually put financial resources where they make that happen. Because right now Americans are hunkering down in many places. And on one level I'm cool with it in the sense that Americans should not have to move to have a good life, necessarily. Like I think that's the wrong message. But if they want to move for a job, we have to make it easier for them to do so. Yeah.
Hi. So I think number one threat facing us right now is climate change. And I know you were asked about it in the second debate, and I want to just hear your thoughts on what we should do about climate change and give you more than 10 seconds that CNN gives you,
Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you for giving me the benefit of the doubt. So if you remember in the last debate, I staked out the new third position on climate change. The one position you're used to is we have to fight climate change. Number two position is climate change isn't that big a deal. It's like a hoax or whatever. And then now the new Andrew Yang position, which is it's worse than you thought. And that's where I am. That's where the numbers are. According to studies out of Greenland, the ice pack is melting at the rate they projected in 2050. Like much worse than anyone thought. The UN just released a study saying we will be okay if 90% of the world goes vegetarian immediately. So these are just the these are like the authoritative scientific studies coming out.
That's a problem.
So we need to try and transition to a more sustainable economy and have more renewable energy sources. But we also have to recognize that that will not do the trick. That in a world where we're only 15% of global emissions, the rest of the world's 85%. And you know what's happening in the rest of the world? China is investing massive resources in renewable energy, but then they're exporting their dirty coal power plants to Africa. They literally are just taking coal power plants and being like, hey, Africa, great news for you. I've got a power plant. It burns coal. Do you want it? And then Africa's like, yes, please. Now, here you go. So they have this incredibly dirty energy signature coming out of the developing world because it's cheaper. So the only way for us to make that stuff cleaner would be to go in and say, look, this is going to be better than the coal plant, and here are the solar panels and wind turbines. And right now, we don't have the will or the resources to make that competitive for them. So I'm for doing everything we can to improve our emissions, but I also want to start investing in mitigation. And in this community, you all started to see the worst effects of climate change creeping up. So mitigation is trying to make our communities more resilient. It's investing in levees and storm-resistant infrastructure, but it's also reforesting parts of the country because it turns out planting lots of trees is one of the best things you can do to mitigate carbon emissions. And we need to reforest our oceans. Now, hear me out. This sounds kind of odd, but the Atlantic Ocean is losing between 4 and 8% of its biomass a year right now. It's catastrophic over time. Like the ocean, it's not a uniform body of water. There are actually many parts of the ocean that are filled with life, and then others that are completely empty. And unfortunately, the parts that are filled with life are starting to get depleted. So what we need to do is we need to put permaculture, marine permaculture arrays of kelp underneath the water in particular areas and help regrow the marine ecosystems. That's not cheap, but it's much cheaper than catastrophe over time. So I'm about to release a comprehensive climate change plan that includes not just mitigation, but also trying to counteract some of the worst effects, both on land and in the oceans. So as you can tell, like I'm very, very concerned about climate change. I just don't think that curbing emissions will actually pull it back. At this point, the horse is out of the barn. I don't know if that's
Not cheering news.
And what I say is, like, I wish I had better news to report, but the numbers are pretty clear. Yes, in the back.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned democracy dollars, and I think that's a beautiful solution for campaign finance corruption. But what about after the politicians get elected? What's to stop an oil lobbyist, what's to stop a war lobbyist from writing them a blank check?
Well, I think what you're describing just there hopefully falls under our anti-corruption, anti-bribery laws, but in a related policy, we should have term limits for members of Congress.
Can we give you some names?
But they go to D.C. and they're like, ooh, I kind of like it here. Let me stick around. And then they rattle around for a long time. It should not be a career. It should be a calling and a vocation. You get as much done as you can in that time frame, and then you come home. And if that's not why you're there, then you shouldn't be there in the first place. So it's not just democracy dollars; it's also term limits and say, look, like you have a particular period of time. And then you'd see all these legislators, I believe, improving their behavior because they know that they can't stick around forever.
So would that also include like civilian oversight to make sure that they don't take extra money?
Well, I have some rules that I'm just suggesting around not becoming a lobbyist after you leave government, because that's a revolving door.
Yeah.
I have good friends who went to Capitol Hill with the best of intentions, and one of them said to me straight up, he's like, I would never become a lobbyist. 12 years later, guess what he is? A lobbyist. You know? And it's just because that's the most lucrative professional opportunity that awaits you after you've worked on Capitol Hill. So we need to make it so that that is not the case. Try and have curbs to become lobbyists post-Capitol Hill. One of the things I've said I would do as president is I said that I would have a lifetime ban on presidents getting any money for personal gain afterwards, because if you're a human being and you know that someone can give you $250,000 to give a speech to their employees after you leave office, then the natural temptation is just to be a little easier on them. You know, so you have to try and get that temptation off the board, and culture start at the top. If the president's taking paid speeches for money after they leave office, then everyone in government looks around and be like, all right, I guess being a lobbyist is fine too. It's like you end up having this cascade of mercenary behavior. So you have to say, look, president, no more money. You'll live a fine life, but no more getting paid tons of money after you leave, and then you try to change the culture from the top down. Yes?
How will you handle our problems with North Korea?
So this is a personal aside. My sister-in-law is Korean, and she's giving birth in 2 weeks in Seoul, and my brother's there right now. I was just FaceTiming. So what's going on in Korea is personal to me on a couple of levels. I don't think it's a bad thing to talk to leaders that we disagree with. I think you get more done that way. I think disengaging is a harder way to get things done. The problem with North Korea is that we've gone forward and not had clear demands in terms of, we have this all or nothing approach to diplomacy there. We're saying a total disarmament or nothing, and there are actually things we can accomplish short of total disarmament that would make us safe. Yes?
Talk to me about gun control, gun reform. I have school-age kids. I'm sending my oldest off to school in Columbia, and I am terrified every time I turn on the TV. I want to know what can be done.
I also am a parent of school-age kids. Mine are a bit younger. Is that your daughter?
This is my daughter.
Wow. Are you voting age?
And she's registered.
I'm aligned with Democratic goals in terms of sensible gun safety laws that we haven't been able to get through because of the NRA, and that is part of the lobbyist stranglehold. But I think we need to focus on all of the events in the chain. And I think, to me, the last two events are the most clear that we're all focused on right now, which is how do you buy the gun and then using the gun. Those are the clearest and most catastrophic and most tragic. But then there are many, many things that lead up to it that we need to try and do better. So what am I talking about? We need to try and support families so that there's less trauma and less stress in the household. We have to make it so that schools are less alienating and marginalizing for people with different neurological profiles, because often these are boys who come into schools and they end up becoming bullied and then angry and violent eventually. We have to invest in mental health and mental illness resources. Over 96% of shooters are boys, and so we do need to try and make it easier to be like a maturing young man into society. And it's tied in again to a family. Right now, 40% of American children are being brought up by a single parent, generally a single mom. And studies have shown that if you're a little girl brought up by a single mom, your outcomes are okay. Because you have super mom, and girls are quite adaptable, and things are generally as they should be. If you're a little boy and you grow up with a single mom, unfortunately the data is not as positive, because little boys are more sensitive to parental time inputs. And if they don't have a strong male role model in the house, then they look around and say, okay, I see super mom, I guess guys are not that strong or productive or positive, and then they start to have behavioral problems and academic problems, and then this ends up cascading eventually in some cases to catastrophic violence. So this is the whole chain of events, and we have to try and attack each one. When I spoke to the Everytown group, it said, look, focus on the top two because they're the most proximate. But the reality is, and you all know this here in South Carolina, there are over 300 million firearms in this country. And so if I pass a law tomorrow saying, hey, we make it harder to procure certain types of weapons, that does not make a significant number of the 300 million firearms disappear. Most of them are in private homes. They're there. So one thing we should do, and I would do as president, is have a perpetual gun buyback in effect, where anyone can just turn in a gun for a market value just to reduce the supply over time. The other thing we can do to make guns safer is to offer free upgrades to personalization. And what that means is that the gun can actually be outfitted with a grip recognition sensor that only the owner can fire the gun. And it's not based upon your fingerprint, it's based upon the length of your fingers, where the pressure is coming from. And so if you offer gun owners free personalization, then they'll think it's great, because all of a sudden their gun's like a James Bond gun that only they can fire. So I'll show it off. But it also makes us safer, because then if their troubled teenage son gets a hold of the gun, it's useless. Or if it gets into someone else's hands, it's useless. So we need to recognize that we have this massive supply of guns in this country, try and reduce it over time and try and make it safer. Unfortunately, gun violence is going to be with us for a long time, and we're going to try and take steps at every stage.
Thank you.
All right, y'all. We got time for one last question. I'm sorry.